The first snow of the season fell in thin, wind-driven sheets, dusting the rooftops and muddling the muddy road that wound through the heart of Red Willow Crossing. The town was little more than a scatter of wood-planked storefronts, a saloon, with a warped sign swinging in the wind, and a cluster of cabins set against the tree line. Winter always came early here, biting through the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be without shelter. It was on such a morning that he rode in, a man alone, his broad-brimmed hat tilted low against the cold, a battered oilskin coat snapping in the wind. His horse, a big, dun-colored gelding with a scar along its flank, moved at a steady, unhurried pace, as though both rider and beast had been on the trail for days without stopping. Few in Red Willow Crossing could remember seeing him before. They would have remembered the kind of man who drew notice without asking for it. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had lived hard and long in the open. A faint white scar ran from his left temple down toward his cheek, disappearing under his stubbled jawline. His eyes, clear, pale gray like ice over a mountain stream, moved constantly, reading the town as though every detail mattered. The townsfolk, wrapped in their coats and shawls, watched him from doorways and windows. Travelers came through, often enough, prospectors, trappers, soldiers on leave, but this one was different. He didn't greet anyone, didn't tie his horse at the hitching post in front of the saloon, didn't even glance toward the warm light spilling out of the general store. He rode straight down the center of the street like a shadow cutting through the cold. Inside the saloon, men nursing morning whiskey leaned to get a better look through the frost-clouded window. "Who's that?" muttered Tom Cray, the blacksmith, his voice low. "Don't know," replied the barkeep, polishing a glass with a rag. "But he don't look like he's here to make friends." The stranger guided his horse toward the edge of town, where the lone boarding house stood. It was run by a widow named Mrs. Calder, a woman with sharp eyes and an iron spine who had learned to mind her own business. She stepped out onto the porch as the rider dismounted, boots thudding on the frozen ground. "You looking for a room?" she asked, her voice carrying no welcome, but no hostility either. He nodded once, pulling off his gloves. "A room, just for a few nights." His voice was low, gravelly, the kind that hinted at a life spent talking only when necessary. Mrs. Calder looked him over, the worn coat, the revolver holstered at his hip, the way his left hand rested casually near it even when he wasn't thinking about it. "Payment up front," she said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a few coins, and handed them over without counting. She didn't count them either. Something about the man told her he wasn't one to haggle. As he led his horse to the stable out back, she watched him go. She'd seen men like him before, men who carried their secrets like a second skin. Sometimes they were running from something. Sometimes they were running to it. That night, the wind howled through the narrow street, rattling loose shutters and carrying the scent of wood smoke. The stranger sat alone in his rented room, a tin cup of coffee cooling on the table. He didn't unpack much, just a bedroll, a small pouch, and a worn journal that he opened but didn't write in. He listened instead, the creak of the floorboards as Mrs. Calder moved about downstairs, the clink of glasses from the saloon, the distant howl of a wolf from the forest beyond. He had told himself he'd stay no longer than a few days, just enough time to rest the horse, stock up on supplies, and be on his way. But there was something about this town, something in the way its shadows stretched longer than they should, that stirred the instincts he'd honed over years of survival. By morning he would learn the truth of it, that Red Willow Crossing was not as quiet as it seemed, and that his path would soon cross with some. The next evening came colder than the last. A sharp wind swept through Red Willow Crossing, driving most folks indoors before the sun had even dipped behind the pines. The stranger, hat pulled low, sat in the farthest corner of the saloon, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. He didn't drink whiskey, at least not here, not now. He was a man who preferred to keep his senses clear. The saloon was half full, the usual mix of ranch hands, miners, and drifters trading stories and coins over cards. Their laughter was loud, but it had a brittle edge, the kind that snapped into silence the moment something unusual happened outside. It happened now. Through the bat-wing doors came a burst of sound, boots pounding against frozen earth, the muffled thud of someone running hard. Then a voice, sharp and angry, shouting in the street. The stranger's head lifted just enough for his eyes to track toward the doorway. The next thing he saw was a small shape darting past the open gap in the doors. At first glance, it could have been a town child, but this one wasn't dressed like any of the local kids. The boy's clothes were worn buckskin, frayed at the seams, the kind used by the people of the nearby tribe. His dark hair was tangled, his bare feet pale from the cold, each step leaving faint marks in the thin dusting of snow, and his face, wide-eyed, breathing in sharp bursts, was the face of someone running not for mischief, but for life. The stranger didn't move at first. He simply watched the boy vanish into the alley between the saloon and the livery stable. Then came the second sound, a group of heavier footsteps, quick and purposeful. 4 men appeared on the street. They wore mismatched coats, the kind that still bore the grease stains of hard travel. 2 carried rifles slung low, one had a coil of rope. The leader, a bearded man with a cruel set to his jaw, was scanning the street like a hawk searching for prey. "You see a little savage come through here?" He barked toward a group of townsfolk huddled near the general store. No one answered. The air seemed to tighten. The bearded man spat in the snow. "Boy's worth $50 to us alive. 20 if we have to drag him back less his tongue." Something shifted in the stranger's chest. An old memory, maybe, of a different chase, a different child long ago. He told himself to stay put. This wasn't his fight. He didn't know the boy, didn't know the story, and he certainly didn't need to be on the wrong side of 4 armed men with a bounty in mind. But instinct was a stubborn thing. He rose slowly from his chair, leaving the coffee untouched. The piano player stopped mid-song as the stranger pushed through the bat-wing doors into the cold. Outside, the wind was sharper now, carrying the smell of wood smoke and snow. The alley where the boy had fled was narrow, its shadows deep even in the fading light. The boy was there, crouched low against the wall behind a stack of empty crates. His breath came in visible puffs, his eyes locked on the stranger, and though the language between them was nothing but silence, the message was clear. "Help me." The shouts of the pursuers were getting closer. Boots crunched snow and gravel at the mouth of the alley. The stranger made his choice. He stepped forward, his coat flaring slightly, and crouched beside the boy. He placed one finger to his lips, a universal sign. The boy froze, wide-eyed, but still. In one smooth motion, the stranger lifted the crates aside, revealing a narrow gap in the wallboards of the livery stable. He gestured for the boy to crawl through. The child hesitated for only a second before sliding into the darkness beyond. By the time the bounty hunters reached the alley, the stranger was standing there alone, leaning casually against the wall. His pale eyes gave away nothing. "You see a kid run this way?" the bearded man demanded. The stranger shrugged. "Only thing I saw was the wind." The men stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, they moved on, muttering curses as they fanned out toward the other side of town. The stranger waited until their footsteps faded before turning back toward the stable. Inside, the boy huddled in the hay, watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in days, Thewan, whose life hung in the balance. But for now, he was just another nameless rider passing through. The stable smelled of hay, leather, and the faint musk of horse sweat. The light inside was dim, just enough for the stranger to make out the boy's small form crouched in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest. A thin shaft of winter twilight slipped through a gap in the wallboards, falling across the boy's face. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his breathing was quick, the way it gets after running too far, too fast. The stranger squatted down, resting one arm on his knee. "You got a name?" he asked quietly. The boy blinked at him but said nothing. His lips moved as though he wanted to speak, but the words came out in a tongue the stranger didn't understand, a fluid string of syllables, melodic and urgent. "Can't help you if I don't know what you're saying," the stranger murmured. He tugged off one glove and reached into his coat, pulling out a small piece of dried jerky. He held it out. The boy hesitated, glancing toward the stable door as if expecting danger to burst through at any moment. Finally, hunger won. The boy snatched the jerky, retreating a step deeper into the shadows before chewing cautiously. From outside came the faint crunch of boots on snow. The stranger's jaw tightened. The bounty hunters weren't far. They were sweeping the edges of town, and it wouldn't be long before they thought to check the stables. He rose slowly, weighing his options. This was where the road forked. He could walk away now, pretend he'd never seen the boy, never crossed his path. That would be the sensible thing. He didn't owe the child anything. And helping him? That would mean trouble, and trouble was. Something the stranger had spent the last few years avoiding like a man sidestepping a rattlesnake. He'd been on the run before, not from the law, but from the kind of men who enforced their own rules with bullets and fire. He knew exactly how far men like that would go to get what they wanted. He glanced down at the boy again, barefoot in the snow, clothes worn to threads, small enough that the rope one of the bounty hunters carried could wrap twice around his wrists. The boy swallowed the last bite of jerky and, after a long pause, met the stranger's eyes. His expression wasn't pleading, not exactly. It was something else, a quiet endurance, like he already knew the world was dangerous and cruel, but refused to bow his head to it. That look did it. The stranger moved to the far stall where his own horse was tethered. He lifted the saddle, revealing a false floorboard beneath the straw. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it had saved his skin once before. He pulled it open and motioned for the boy to climb in. The child didn't move at first. The stranger softened his tone. "It's safe, just for a while." He mimed closing the hatch, then opening it again, hoping the boy understood. This time, the boy crept forward. He climbed down into the narrow compartment, curling himself into as small a space as he could. The stranger lowered the hatch, then covered it with straw and set the saddle back on top. Moments later, the stable door creaked, open. The bearded bounty hunter stepped inside, rifle in hand, eyes scanning every corner. "Evening," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The stranger leaned casually against the stall door. "Evening," he replied, as if he had all the time in the world. "We're looking for a little Injun brat," the man said, stepping closer. "You seen him?" The stranger shook his head. "Ain't seen much of anything. Just my horse." The bounty hunter's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before sweeping the rest of the stable. He checked behind barrels, under workbenches, but didn't touch the stall with the stranger's horse. Finally, with a grunt, he turned and walked out. The door closed. Silence returned, broken only by the horses shifting in their stalls. The stranger didn't move for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath. By hiding the boy, he'd crossed an invisible line, one he couldn't uncross by morning. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was sharp enough to cut a man's lungs. With every breath, frost glazed the windows of the boarding house, the saloon, even the stable where the boy remained hidden under the false floor. The stranger rose before dawn, as he always did, and slipped into the stable under the pretense of checking his horse. Carefully, he lifted the saddle, brushed aside the straw, and opened the hatch. Two dark eyes stared up at him, alert but exhausted. He handed the boy a small hunk of bread and a tin cup of water. "Eat quick," he murmured. "We can't have you out for long." The boy ate silently, crumbs sticking to his lips. "When," he finished. He handed the tin back without a word. The stranger closed the hatch again, his mind already working through the next steps. He'd bought the child one night's safety, but it wouldn't last. And he was right. By mid-morning, the bounty hunters had returned, 5 of them this time. They moved through town like a wolf pack, their heavy boots pounding the frozen earth. They questioned everyone they saw, shopkeepers, ranch hands, even the preacher who was nailing a sign to the chapel door. "Kid's gotta be here somewhere," the bearded leader growled to his men. "He's not on the open trail, and no one's seen him head into the hills. That means he's hiding, in town. And if he's here, someone's helping him." That last sentence wasn't just a guess. It was a warning. The stranger was leaning against a post outside the general store when the men passed by. They looked him over, suspicion in their eyes. He met their gaze with the same cold calm as before, giving nothing away. "Name's Pike," the leader said finally, stepping closer. "We're looking for a boy. 8 years old, buckskin clothes, hair down to his shoulders. Belongs to us." "Belongs?" the stranger asked, his voice flat. Pike's jaw twitched. "Was caught trespassing where he shouldn't have been. His tribe's been raiding traps, taking pelts that ain't theirs. We've got a right to take him in. And if we don't find him, well..." He let the thought hang, his eyes narrowing. "Folks who hide him will answer for it." The stranger didn't flinch. "Haven't seen him." Pike studied him for a long beat before turning away. "Keep it that way," he said over his shoulder. The rest of the day was a game of patience. The bounty hunters fanned out in pairs, searching every building they could get into. They banged on doors, shoved their way into barns, even checked the space beneath wagons. Once the stranger spotted 2 of them heading straight toward the stable. He made his move fast, stepping into their path with a half-empty bottle of whiskey in hand. "Boys," he said with a faint grin, "before you go poking around, maybe you want a drink to take the edge off." The younger of the 2 looked tempted, but the older one scowled. "Don't drink with strangers." "Suit yourself," the stranger said, tilting the bottle back and taking a swig, though it wasn't whiskey, but water he'd poured in earlier. Then, as they started to move past him, he staggered deliberately, blocking the doorway. "You sure you're not looking for trouble?" he drawled. The 2 exchanged an irritated glance. "We'll check the stable later," the older one muttered. They moved on. That bought a little more time, but not much. By sundown, Pike was furious. The men had found no trace of the boy. The leader stood in the center of the street, glaring at the townsfolk who dared look his way. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we start tearing this place apart, and if we have to burn a building to get him out, so be it." The stranger heard every word. He didn't believe for a second it was an empty threat. That night, in the stable, he crouched beside the hidden hatch. "We can't stay here," he told the boy, knowing the child couldn't understand all the words, but might hear the urgency in his tone. "Tomorrow, they'll find you. We move before daylight." The first pale light of dawn was only beginning to creep over Red Willow Crossing when the stranger eased open the stable door. His breath curled in white clouds, and the snow underfoot crunched with each careful step. Inside, the horses shifted and snorted, their warm bodies steaming in the cold air. He crouched by the hatch, tapped lightly twice, then lifted it. The boy blinked up at him, bleary-eyed but alert. The stranger motioned for him to climb out. Without a word, the child obeyed, brushing straw from his hair. The stranger handed him a small cloth bundle, bread, a strip of smoked meat, and a flask of water. The boy took it without question, tucking it into the leather satchel slung across his chest. Outside, the town was still asleep. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and the only sound was the faint groan of the wind pushing against the eaves. The stranger led the boy along the narrow back lanes between buildings, keeping to the shadows. At the edge of town, they slipped behind the smithy and into the thin line of pines that bordered the frozen creek. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. Or in the boy's case, bare feet wrapped in torn strips of cloth the stranger had scavenged from an old feed sack. The child didn't complain once, though his small shoulders hunched against the cold. After a while, the stranger stopped, knelt in the snow, and drew a crude map with a stick. 2 crooked lines for the mountains, a loop for the creek, a dot for the town. He tapped the mountains, then pointed at the boy, then back to the town, shaking his head. The boy watched intently. Then he crouched beside the stranger and drew a small circle within the mountains. He tapped it twice, then placed his hand over his chest. "Home," the stranger guessed quietly. The boy didn't answer in English, but his faint smile told him he was right. From then on, their communication became a language of its own, part gestures, part drawings, part shared understanding born of necessity. When they stopped to rest, beneath a rocky overhang, the boy pulled something from his satchel, a carved wooden figure, worn smooth from years of handling. It was shaped like a bird with outstretched wings. He held it out to the stranger. The man took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. It was no toy. It had weight, both in its craftsmanship and in the way the boy's eyes followed it. He handed it back without a word, and the boy tucked it safely away. Hours later, as the sun dipped low, they heard the distant crack of rifle fire. The stranger froze, scanning the trees. The sound was faint, but it carried with it a familiar rhythm. Search parties, firing into the air to signal one another. The boy's breathing quickened. The stranger placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep moving," he said, softly, though he knew the child didn't understand the words. Still, the tone seemed to calm him. By nightfall, they'd found shelter in a shallow cave. The stranger built a small fire, careful to shield it from view with piled stones. They shared what little food they had, and the boy curled up close to the heat. For a long time, the stranger sat with his back against the cave wall, watching the firelight dance on the stone. The boy slept lightly, shifting now and then, but each time his eyes opened, they found the stranger still there. And each time, the boy seemed to relax again, as if reassured that the man would not vanish in the night. It struck the stranger then. This was the first time in years someone had looked at him like that, with trust, with the unspoken belief that he would keep them safe. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him he thought long dead began to stir. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it now. The boy wasn't just a responsibility. He was a promise. And the stranger had never been the kind of man to break one. By the second day in the mountains, the snow had deepened, swallowing their footprints as quickly as they made them. It should have been a blessing, but the stranger knew it also slowed their pace. The boy's legs were shorter, his steps unsteady on the steeper slopes, and they had to stop often to rest. The stranger kept them moving off the main game trails, skirting through stands of spruce and alder, always uphill toward the ridgeline. The air grew thinner, sharper, but it carried something else now. Echoes. More than once he caught the distant sound of men's voices carried on the wind. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge where the creek ran black and fast beneath a skin of ice. The stranger tested the frozen edges with the tip of his boot. "Too thin," he muttered. They would have to follow it upstream until it narrowed enough to cross. The boy tugged lightly on his coat sleeve and pointed to the ridge above them. The stranger squinted, then swore under his breath. Movement, faint but unmistakable. 2 riders, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. The bounty hunters had made better time than he'd hoped. He grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him into the tree line, crouching low among the snow-laden branches. The riders paused at the edge of the gorge, scanning the valley below. One of them dismounted, bending to study the ground. The stranger's heart pounded slow and heavy in his ears. If they found so much as a half-print in the snow, the chase would be over. The boy shifted slightly, and the stranger pressed a steadying hand against his shoulder. Still, he mouthed. Minutes dragged into what felt like an hour. Finally, the rider remounted, and the two turned their horses back toward the ridge. The stranger waited until they were gone before exhaling. They pressed on, but the respite was short-lived. That night, they camped in a hollow beneath a rock shelf, using a small fire for warmth. The boy had just begun to doze when the stranger heard it, a faint creak of snow under weight, too measured to be an animal. He doused the fire in an instant, plunging them into darkness. Then he pulled the boy close, whispering in the barest breath, "Quiet." The crunch of footsteps drew nearer. A shadow passed across the opening of their hollow, pausing as though listening. The stranger reached for his revolver, cocking the hammer back with a soft click that seemed deafening in the stillness. But the shadow moved on, fading into the night. Only when the sounds were gone did he lower the weapon. The boy's small fingers still clung to his coat. By dawn, they were moving again, both quieter than before. They crossed the creek where the ice had thickened, the boy following each of the stranger's steps exactly. The final close call came just past midday. The trail they followed bent sharply, leading into a stand of willows. And there, blocking the path ahead, stood Pike himself, rifle in hand, his coat dusted with snow. The boy froze. The stranger's mind worked in a flash. Retreat meant they'd be boxed in by Pike's men. Fighting meant risking the boy in the crossfire. That left only one option: misdirection. He stepped forward, putting himself between Pike and the boy. "Looking for someone?" he asked, voice steady, almost casual. Pike's eyes narrowed. "I think you already know." His gaze flicked past the stranger, but by then, the boy had melted into the brush, just as the stranger had intended when he shifted to block the view. The man and the bounty hunter stared at each other, the air between them taut as wire. Then Pike gave a slow smile. "You're making a mistake." Pike's grin vanished. He lowered the rifle just enough to let the tension hang in the air. "We'll find him," he said, his voice low and sure. "And when we do, we'll make you wish you'd kept walking through this town." The stranger didn't answer. He stood still until Pike turned and vanished into the trees, his boots crunching against the snow. Only when the sound faded did the stranger move, glancing toward the stand of brush where the boy had hidden. A small head emerged. The boy crept out, silent as snowfall. His eyes darted to where Pike had been standing moments earlier, then back to the stranger. There was no fear in his gaze now, only trust, and something else: determination. They didn't waste time. The stranger led him deeper into the woods, weaving between pine and spruce, always angling upward toward the mountain pass. The climb was slow, the snow deeper here, but each step took them further from Pike's men. The pass loomed ahead by midday, a jagged cut in the mountains where the wind whistled like a living thing. Snow swirled between the sheer rock walls, and drifts piled knee-high in places. The path was narrow, the kind where a single misstep could send a person sliding down an icy slope into the valley below. The stranger glanced at the boy's wrapped feet, raw from days of travel. He crouched and adjusted the cloth strips, pulling them tighter, then stood and offered his hand. The boy hesitated only a moment before taking it. They moved carefully. The wind here was sharper, carrying the sound of each footstep farther than it should. Somewhere behind them, faint but distinct, the stranger thought he heard the clink of metal and the muffled voices of men. Pike's crew had found their trail again. He increased their pace, urging the boy along the narrow switchback that wound upward. At one point, a loose stone gave way beneath the boy's foot, sending it skittering down into the abyss. The stranger caught his arm just in time, pulling him back to solid ground. The boy's breath came fast, but he managed a small nod of thanks before pressing on. Near the crest of the pass, they took shelter behind a boulder to rest. From here, the stranger could see far down the valley they had left. Dark figures moving. Slowly upward, rifles slung, their breath steaming in the cold air. The bounty hunters were relentless, and they were closing in. The stranger studied the terrain ahead. Beyond the pass, the mountains gave way to a wide basin, thick with forest and broken by a frozen river. Somewhere past that river lay the boys. Home, the place he had marked on the crude map days ago. They started the descent, but the slope on this side was treacherous. Icy ledges forced them to pick their way slowly, and the wind carried the occasional groan of shifting snow. The stranger knew the signs. This was avalanche country. One loud noise, one heavy step in the wrong place could bring the whole slope down on them. Halfway down, the boy stopped and pointed to the horizon. The stranger followed his gaze. Smoke rose in thin columns from beyond the tree line. Too far to be Pike's men. It had to be the boy's tribe. For the first time in days, hope flickered. But hope could be dangerous. It made people careless. As they neared the tree line, the stranger caught movement from the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping between the pines. Then another. They weren't alone down here. He crouched, pulling. The boy down beside him. A faint whistle cut through the air, followed by the crack of a branch under a boot. Pike's men had split up, some coming over the pass, others circling ahead. The stranger scanned the terrain, searching for an advantage. His gaze settled on a narrow gully to their left, half hidden by snowdrifts. It would be harder to follow, in there, but if they could get through it, they might be able to slip past the hunters entirely. He met the boy's eyes and gave a short nod. No words were needed. They ducked into the gully, the snow nearly to their thighs, every step an effort. Behind them, voices called out, closer now, urgent. The stranger didn't look back. The pass had been crossed, but the real danger lay ahead. If they made a mistake now, they'd never reach the safety of the tribal lands. The gully narrowed until its walls pressed close, forcing them to move in single file. The snow here was untouched, deep enough to slow even the strongest man, but it hid them from sight. Each step was a silent battle against exhaustion. The boy stumbled once, his foot catching on a hidden branch. The stranger turned, steadying him, then motioned to keep low. From above, voices echoed. Pike's men, frustrated and winded but still. Hunting. Then came the whistle. The stranger froze. It was the same signal he'd heard before. Short, sharp, a predator's call to its pack. He knew what it meant. Pike's crew had found their tracks leading into the gully. They would follow. The stranger's eyes swept the walls. About 30 yards ahead, the gully curved sharply to the left and opened into a clearing. Beyond that was the forest, a dense wall of pines that could hide them if they reached it first. But he also knew the hunters would be quicker now, their boots crunching down the slope in a reckless push to cut them off. They hurried, breath clouding the cold air. At the curve, the stranger risked a glance back. Shapes emerged at the top of the gully. 3 men, rifles in hand, snow spraying with each step. Pike wasn't among them, but his presence was everywhere in the hard set of their jaws. Go, the stranger hissed to the boy, giving him a push toward the trees. The boy didn't argue. He bolted. The first rifle shot cracked, splintering a branch near the stranger's head. He dropped into the snow, drawing the revolver from his belt. He fired once, forcing the men to scatter along the gully wall. Itzti was enough. The boy disappeared into the pines. The stranger ran after him, weaving through the trees. The snow was thinner here, but the undergrowth was thick, branches clawing at his coat. Another shot rang out, closer this time, the bullet whining past his ear. Then, from ahead, came a deeper sound, the crunch of heavy boots and the faint jingle of spurs. The stranger slowed, realizing with a cold certainty Pike had circled around, away. Bounty Hunter stepped from behind a tree, rifle leveled. His breath steamed in the air, his eyes cold as the steel in his hands. "End of the trail," Pike said. The stranger stopped, his revolver still in hand but hanging at his side. Pike's crew fanned out behind him, trapping the stranger between. Two lines of gunmen. The boy's voice cut through the tense silence. "Run!" he shouted from somewhere in the trees. The sound made Pike's head turn ever so slightly. The stranger didn't waste the moment. He dropped to one knee, firing, twice in rapid succession. The first shot slammed into the snow at Pike's feet, making him stumble. The second tore through the branch above his head, showering him in ice and bark. Before Pike could recover, the stranger rolled behind a fallen log, reloading with quick, practiced movements. Gunfire erupted from both sides, bullets thudding. Into the wood. The boy's voice called again, farther away now. He was still moving toward safety. The stranger knew he couldn't win a drawn-out fight. He had to break their line. He reached into his coat and pulled a small stick of dynamite, the kind miners used in the high passes. He struck a match on the log, lit the fuse, and hurled it toward the gully entrance. The explosion ripped through the clearing, sending snow and debris into the air. Pike's men dove for cover, shouting. Smoke filled the space between them. The stranger used the chaos to slip away, sprinting toward the sound of the boy's voice. The forest closed around him, hiding the shapes behind the smoke. After several long minutes of running, he burst into a small clearing at the edge of the frozen river. The boy stood there, wide-eyed, pointing toward the far bank. Across the ice, dark figures emerged from the tree line, warriors from the boy's tribe, bows drawn, spears ready. For the first time, the stranger felt the tension ease from his shoulders. They had reached the edge of safety. The frozen river lay before them, a white expanse stretching nearly 50 yards to the far bank. The ice glimmered under the pale light, cracked in faint spiderweb lines that whispered of danger. Beyond it, the boy's tribe stood in silent formation, tall, proud, and unflinching. The stranger's boots crunched as he stepped forward, pulling the boy close to his side. He could feel the youth's heart pounding, whether from fear or relief, he couldn't tell. From the trees behind came the shouts. Pike's men closing in. The stranger's gut told him they had less than a minute before the hunters broke into view. One of the warriors on the far bank lifted a hand, signaling them to hurry, but the stranger hesitated, scanning the river. The ice looked thin near the middle, the faint blue shimmer beneath hinting at frigid water that would swallow them whole if it gave way. "You trust me?" he asked the boy quietly. The boy nodded, without hesitation. "Then stay right on my heels, step where I step." They moved onto the ice. Each footfall was a prayer. The surface groaned under their weight, tiny cracks racing outward like spider legs. Halfway across, the first shot rang out from the tree line behind them. Snow puffed into the air near the stranger's boot. Pike's men had arrived. The stranger didn't return fire. To shoot would mean stopping, and stopping meant dying here. He pressed forward, the boy close behind. Then Pike's voice cut across the cold like a knife. "You give me the boy and you walk away breathing." The stranger didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the far bank, where the warriors had now moved into the shallows, spears lowering toward the enemy. Another crack split the air. This one not from a rifle, but from beneath their feet. A jagged fissure ran between the stranger's boots, spreading fast. "Run!" he barked. They sprinted the last 10 yards, the ice splintering with every step, just as the boy leapt to the frozen bank. A section behind them gave way with a violent splash. Freezing water surged up, threatening to pull the stranger under. A strong hand shot out, one of the warriors gripping his wrist and hauling him to safety. The boy rushed to his people, who surrounded him with murmured relief, but there was no time to celebrate. Pike and his men emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, stopping short at the river's edge. The two sides faced each other across the shattered ice. Pike stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's mine you're protecting," he spat, jerking his head toward the boy. "There's a bounty big enough to buy all of you 10 times over." The warriors didn't move. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved in stone, took a slow step forward. "This child is of our blood," he said in a voice like distant thunder. "No gold will change that." Pike's lip curled, but even he wasn't fool enough to step onto the broken ice. He looked past the warriors, locking eyes with the stranger. "This ain't over," Pike called. "You're marked now. I'll find you." The stranger didn't flinch. He simply raised his revolver in a loose, casual grip, not aiming, but making it clear he wasn't unarmed. Pike lingered a moment longer, then turned with a sharp motion. His men melted back into the forest, their footsteps fading into the snow. The stranger let out a slow breath. He knew Pike's words weren't empty. The man was the kind to settle debts. But for now, the boy was safe. The warrior leader approached, his gaze studying the stranger as though weighing the man's soul. "You risked much for one who is not your own," he said. The stranger's reply was quiet. "Felt like the right thing to do." The leader gave a single nod, then motioned for them to follow. The boy grabbed the stranger's hand, his small fingers gripping tightly. Together, they walked toward the tribe's camp, the frozen river, and its dangers fading behind them. But deep inside, the stranger knew the storm wasn't truly over. Pike's shadow would follow him, one way or another. The tribe's camp was a cluster of lodges nestled in a snowy valley, the smoke from their fires curling upward into the cold sky. As the stranger and the boy approached, people emerged from their homes, their eyes widening at the sight. Some whispered in surprise, others simply stared, reading the truth in the boy's tired but unharmed face. The boy's mother broke through the crowd, her cry sharp and full of both grief and joy. She dropped to her knees, arms, wrapping around her son so tightly it seemed she would never let go again. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she murmured words in her language, rocking him gently. The stranger looked away, giving them privacy, but he couldn't help the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd seen enough loss in his life to know moments like this were rare and worth any danger. The tribe's leader stepped forward, his face solemn. "You crossed into danger for the child of our blood," he said, his deep voice carrying so that all could hear. "For this, you have earned not only our thanks, but our protection." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Warriors stepped forward, each touching a hand to the stranger's shoulder in a silent gesture of respect. Women pressed food and furs into his arms. Even the children peered at him with wide eyes, whispering his name as if he were a figure from an old story. The boy stood beside him again, his hand clutching the stranger's coat sleeve. "You're staying, aren't you?" he asked softly. The stranger hesitated. His life had been a long road of quiet wandering, never staying anywhere long enough for the ground to feel like home. Staying meant roots, and roots could be pulled up. But leaving meant breaking this small bond they'd forged through fire and frost. "I don't know," he admitted, "but for now, I'm not going anywhere." That night, the tribe held a feast in his honor. Around the fire, stories were told, some of the boy's return, others of the stranger's courage. He said little, letting the voices of the people fill the night air. But his eyes kept scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, because some part of him knew Pike wasn't done. Later, when most had drifted to their lodges, the leader found him sitting at the edge of camp, staring out into the moonlit snow. "You think the hunter will return," the leader said, more statement than question. "I know he will," the stranger replied. "Men like Pike don't let go, And he knows I'm out here now." The leader was silent for a moment. Then he said, "When that day comes, you will not stand alone. You have given us a debt we cannot repay in words. We will fight beside you." The stranger inclined his head in gratitude. It wasn't the kind of promise he took lightly. The boy appeared then, wrapped in a thick blanket, his eyes already heavy with sleep. He sat down next to the stranger without a word, leaning against him. The warmth of the child's trust seeped through the man's rough exterior like fire through cold stone. As the fire crackled in the distance and the snow fell in slow, lazy drifts, the stranger let himself relax. Just a little. He knew the road ahead would not be peaceful. Pike's shadow was still out there, stretching long across the land. But for tonight, there was safety. There was gratitude. There was the knowledge that, for once, he had stood where it mattered most. The boy's breathing slowed as he drifted off, and the stranger stayed there beside him until the first pale light of dawn touched the sky. In that fragile moment between night and day, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. He belonged somewhere. And if Pike came for them, he would find not just one man standing in his way, but an entire tribe ready to defend their own.